Hey everybody, this is Pete McGilvery. We're here for the second of a two-part webinar series for alternative corridor evaluation. We're going to go through today the detailed practitioner view, so the various products that we've identified to support ACE, so things like the methodology memorandum, the ACE report, and how you deal with comments and how you address everything. That's what this webinar is intended to hit on for the most part. We already did a part one, which was last week. It's been recorded, it's been uploaded to our website. It gave an overview of the ACE process and how it fits into our various other DOT processes. And just like last time, we were joined by a fantastic group of trainers. We've got Sylvia, you wave Sylvia. We've got Ted.
Hey.
And we've got Chris. I gave a detailed bio for these guys, but they have lots of experience. And quite honestly, we got a lot of information to go through today. So I'm going to quickly turn it over to Sylvia, and we're just going to get going. There is a question box. If you got questions, I know she's going to tell you on the next slide. Feel free to add in the questions. We're paying attention. There'll be opportunities to engage and ask questions throughout, and we'll make sure that we stay up on the question box and provide responses. So with that, Sylvia, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll get going.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the ACE webinar. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded just as webinar 1 was, and the link is actually on the slide, and I believe, Pete, you're going to put that in the little question box as well. A series of handouts were developed. As a reminder, you don't need to download those now. Those will also be on the website. If you're watching with multiple people, please remember to include the names of those folks on the question box. That way we can give them the proper credit, whether that's PE or AICP. We're still working on the AICP. So during the webinar, if you have a question, go ahead and place that in the question box. We have a team monitoring those questions, and we'll open it up after each lesson to address the questions. This webinar is much longer than webinar 1, so we have scheduled a break in between. Excellent, great. So webinar 2, a two-part webinar. In this webinar, we're going to start off with Chris, who will walk you through the initial analysis and the connection to ETDM. Then Ted will take us over and show you how to develop a methodology memorandum. I'll come back in lesson 3 and I'll go over tips on applying the methodology and conducting the analysis. And Chris is going to close us out and tie it all together with the ACE report. We will also be highlighting best practices and lessons learned. As a reminder, refer to the ACE process into the ETDM manual chapters 3 and 4 and the PD&E manual part 1 chapter 4. And another reminder, here's some recommended trainings. It helps to set the context for ACE. So we're going to quickly review a couple slides from webinar 1 just to set the stage for this training. As you recall, the overarching intent of the ACE process is to minimize the number of alternatives that go into full NEPA or full PD&E analysis. This upfront planning work may result in elimination of corridors, which may avoid potential dispute resolutions. The remaining alternatives may reduce the environmental impact and as a result may even lower the class of action. The ACE process establishes a consistent statewide approach, but it also allows flexibility to district practitioners. So early results and decisions adopted or incorporated by reference into the ACE process may help you shorten your project delivery schedules. But if you recall, adoption and use of ACE decisions in the NEPA process is subject to determination by the lead agency. So here's a graphic we presented in webinar 1, and we're going to go into a lot more detail into each of these steps. If you recall from a high-level perspective, the ACE process generally follows 3 main components: the initial analysis, conducting the actual ACE study, and documenting in the ACER. So in webinar 1, we highlighted the different scenarios, and really the difference depends on how much information you have. So in scenario 1, you have no information, and you might be using the ACE process to develop the study area and refine it. In scenario 2, you probably have information on your study area and you're using the process to identify and refine your corridors. And finally, in scenario 3, that's when you have the most information. You might have conducted a feasibility study, already have initial corridors identified and using it to refine the corridors as well as eliminate. So with that, I think we're ready to get started into lesson 1. So Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sylvia. Good morning, everyone. Let's get into the initial steps before conducting the ACE study. So at this point, you should know that you're going to conduct an ACE study. Before starting the ACE study, you're going to perform initial analysis to whether define the study area or identify corridors which will be evaluated during the ACE study. You'll notice that there's a lot of flexibility in the ACE process to use a best fit approach based on where you are in the process and what you know at the time you are engaging into this process. So I'm going to walk you through the key steps for this initial analysis. The very first step is figuring out whether you want to define the study area or identify corridors that address purpose and need. The next few slides provide guidance to help you select the approach for the initial analysis. Should we select a study area or should we get into identifying corridors? So you'll want to define a study area when you're conducting an ETDM planning screen and there's limited information on the project. Perhaps the only information you have on the project is from the MPO's long-range transportation plan. Another reason is it's a large study area, which has a potential to narrow down, a potential to break up the study area into sub-areas for analysis. The West Bay Parkway project, which is listed on the bottom of your screen, included a study area analysis which assisted in refining the study area and identifying corridors for the study area, for the ACE study. You can also jump straight into identifying corridors during the ETDM planning screen stage. This could be an approach if the study area seems appropriate, or perhaps you already have preliminary corridors from a planning study or a master plan. And of course, if there's time constraints, whether from local governments or legislative mandates, then perhaps it makes sense to start identifying corridors. So technically, you have the option during the ETDM planning screen stage. However, during the ETDM programming screen, you need to begin identifying corridors for the ACE study. Now that we figured out what outcome we want from this initial analysis, let's dig in. Just like any project, you gather information. Some of this information should have already been gathered when deciding to select an approach for the initial analysis. You use this information to begin defining some of the project parameters. As a starting point, there should be something from the MPO's long-range transportation plan or the strategic intermodal systems plan. If there's a planning study, that should also be considered. So what's the purpose and need of the project? You need to describe this before defining the study area or identifying corridors. Is the purpose of the project to relieve traffic demand from a local community? Do you want to connect interstate systems and arterial roadways? What is the project? Is it an expressway, an arterial, a bicycle and pedestrian corridor? Is it in an urban setting, a rural community, a natural area? And where will the project connect? Do you have a begin and end point? If the intent is to identify corridors from the initial analysis, then you first need to determine what type of corridor path or analysis. Swaths are the largest types of corridor paths. This is where a lot of ACE studies start out. Broad corridors are more defined. You'll have a clear idea of the typical section, but keep it a little wider for future refinements. And a narrower alignment is when you have a defined typical section. This could be the result from the ACE study and what you would want to take into the PD&E phase. When determining the corridor width for the analysis, there are several scenarios about how the project develops from the initial analysis to the ACE study. As you can see from this image, the ACE process provides a lot of flexibility for where you start and end. The width of the corridor selected during the initial analysis and ACE study is a function of the individual project and study area under consideration. Smaller widths may be appropriate in projects where there is a clear definition of potential impact areas to avoid. In other circumstances, you'd want to select a wider footprint, which provides flexibility when refining the corridors during the ACE study. Overall, when identifying corridor widths for analysis, it's recommended to select widths that are wide enough to allow the design of the alternatives to shift as needed to avoid potential impacts. Corridor widths can narrow as the study progresses, and they usually do. As the ACE study is being developed and the typical section features are defined, the evaluation width of the alternative corridors can be narrowed to represent the potential typical section that could be used in the PD&E phase. During the initial analysis stage, you should also begin to identify basic design elements such as type of facility, context classification, the potential design speed. These are needed to identify the horizontal curvature that you'll apply to the corridor paths. That way they have a realistic alignment. Access points. At the very least, start with a beginning and ending access point for each corridor. Consider intermediate access points such as interchanges or intersections. And this is subjective, but identify a reasonable number of corridors. Once you have the project parameters such as purpose and need, a general study area, and have an idea of what the corridor paths and width will be used for the analysis, it's time to identify corridors or refine the study area. There are two primary activities that assist with defining a study area or corridors for the ACE study. One is assessing their ability to meet purpose and need, and two, the potential impacts to environmental resources. For instance, corridors may be identified based on environmental resource mapping. Then you develop future traffic projections to check if they address purpose and need. This could also be accomplished in reverse order, where corridors are first identified based on their ability to meet purpose and need. Corridor refinements could occur, which prompt reanalysis. In addition to these primary measures, there's more that can and should be considered depending on the project and the study area. Let's talk some more about the purpose and need. Most ACE studies are for new corridors, so the primary purpose and need goals are usually connectivity and improving traffic conditions. Evaluating a corridor's ability to meet purpose and need could be as simple as corridors connecting an economic employment area to residential communities. Or it could be more intense effort like developing future traffic projections. Although, since traffic is usually a primary goal, we recommend initial and early traffic analysis to define and later refine alternative corridors. This is at a conceptual stage, so traffic analysis should match this level of information, which for most ACE studies is focused on future traffic projections. Future traffic projections could be an iterative process where corridors are initially laid out, access points are conceptualized, future traffic demand is then forecasted and compared with other corridors. Refinements are made, and then traffic is rerun. At the end of this iterative process, a set of alternative corridors are identified that seem to address the purpose and need for the project. This could also be used to eliminate corridors or even a study area before conducting the ACE study. If it doesn't meet purpose and need, then it should no longer be considered. Here we have the West Bay Parkway project. Prior to the ACE study, a corridor feasibility study was conducted as the initial analysis to refine the study area and corridors. The primary purpose and need goals for this project were mobility and connectivity. You'll notice that on the map on the screen, it has three distinct regions. Future traffic was projected by laying out corridors along the limits of each region, and then the results for each region were compared against the purpose and need. Notice that at the top region 1 resulted in low mobility benefits, poor regional connectivity, and the longest travel time. The region 1, which is that northern region on the map, did not address the purpose and need of the project. The initial analysis effectively eliminated this northern region prior to conducting the ACE study. The environmental evaluation for the initial analysis is largely based on desktop analysis. GIS is used to identify sensitive environmental resources, which assists in identifying corridor paths. Corridor paths are based on the selected corridor widths and designed using the preliminary design criteria, which we discussed earlier, such as the horizontal curvature. Corridor paths are laid out on a GIS-based map to avoid or minimize impacts to sensitive environmental features to the extent feasible, sometimes meandering from beginning to endpoint. One GIS analysis technique used by several ACE studies is land suitability mapping. It's a best practice to consider using this method. Another GIS tool is the ETDM Environmental Screening Tools Area of Interest feature, which allows you to screen corridors without initiating an official ETDM screening event. Land suitability mapping is a helpful tool to identify initial corridors during the initial analysis stage and could also be used during the ACE study. It is a GIS-based mapping approach that identifies areas that corridors should avoid or minimize impacts. This technique utilizes existing GIS databases to identify environmental features within a study area, such as social, cultural, natural, and physical features. This could include parks, wetlands, endangered species, cultural resources, and community centers. The environmental features are combined in a GIS map. Levels of shading on the map are based on the cumulative number of environmental features in the area. Land suitability mapping uses progressively darker shades to indicate the least desirable paths for the placement of corridors, as shown on the map on your screen. These darker shades could be avoidance features. There could be instances where features that are alone seem significant enough to be an avoidance area. For instance, maybe a national or state park could be an avoidance area. Avoidance features may be identified using ETAC commentary, stakeholder outreach, and the district's knowledge of the area. Once fully mapped, corridors are developed within the lighter and non-colored areas of the map to the extent feasible, as these areas represent locations that minimize impacts to the greatest extent practical. Although land suitability mapping is a common technique used for ACE studies, it may not apply to all projects. For instance, if there's a study area that has the same environmental resource that's uniformly distributed throughout the study area, and there's no clear distinction. Keep in mind that land suitability mapping could be used for the initial analysis and during the ACE study. FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM, can advise you regarding statewide consistency on land suitability mapping. There could be instances where you have a large study area and start with general alignments that have several variations of links, which when combined create a high number of corridors. This could be an opportunity to narrow down the number of links, but still maintain the general alignments. In these situations, a high-level qualitative analysis could assist with narrowing down the links for the ACE study. It may be ideal to create sub-areas or segments of analysis grouping corridor paths that are similar. Evaluate the individual links and their potential environmental impacts. Compare and check which ones are significant to eliminate those links. The State Road 836 Southwest Extension project performed this initial analysis prior to the ACE study. The project started with 3 general alignments, but several interchangeable links, which could create up to 46 possible corridor combinations. Several of these corridors share the same access points and similar links. To better understand the sensitivity of environmental resources, data was collected and input was received from agencies, the public, and environmental organizations. The individual links were then screened, and the analysis showed links with disproportional impacts to environmentally sensitive lands, projects such as the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, wetland mitigation lands, and habitat fragmentation. The result of this high-level analysis eliminated 7 links due to unavoidable impacts. This resulted in 10 corridors for the ACE study, and the 3 general alignments were maintained. The initial analysis was documented in the Alternative Corridor Evaluation Report. The naming convention that you begin with during the initial analysis should be preserved in the ACE study and even the PD&E study. Therefore, if you have corridors A, B, and C in the initial analysis and eliminate corridor B, the ACE study, you'll evaluate corridors A and C. This should be explained in the ETDM screening event and methodology memorandum of the ACE study. Multimodal features should also be considered. In an urban area, transit corridors could be evaluated as part of the initial analysis. There could also be rail corridors to consider, and even shared use paths or trails, such as the Sun Trail network. After the initial analysis is performed, this could be a decision point to continue the ACE study. If there are significant fatal flaws, then perhaps a project needs to be developed further prior to the ACE study. Now that you have the study area or the initial corridors, it's time to screen them. Prepare a standard ETDM screening event, whether a planning screen or a programming screen. As part of the development of this webinar, we interviewed several ETAT members to get their feedback. One approach that was well received was to conduct a kickoff webinar with the ETAT team prior to the ETDM screening event. Since ACE studies are usually complex projects with multiple corridors and large study areas, this kickoff webinar helps to create an understanding of the project and corridors, and it helps ETAT members with their review. The screening is going to include the standard information about the project, purpose and need, study area, the corridors, a preliminary environmental discussion. The project description should mention that the ACE process will be conducted. When this information is ready, the project can be screened. OEM performs a pre-screening of the project. During the screening, ETAT members are going to provide their input on each relevant environmental resource in the study area and the potential impacts by each corridor. The ETDM screening event is then documented in a preliminary screening summary report. The information from this report is used in the next steps of the ACE process by helping to identify sensitive environmental resources and create the analysis approach for the study. After the preliminary screening summary report, the next step is to develop the methodology memorandum. But before we get into that, keep in mind that the ACE process is embedded within the ETDM process. After the preliminary screening summary report, the ETDM is revisited with 2 ACE deliverables. One is the methodology memorandum, and 2 is the alternative corridor evaluation report, or ACER. The final ETDM summary report is published after approval of the ACER. A best practice that we've found while performing our research was to consult with OEM when there are issue resolutions prior to the methodology memorandum. This discussion could help shape the analysis approach within the methodology memorandum. Another best practice is to conduct field reviews and invite ETAT members. If they can't make it, then consider a virtual field review, where the project team performs the actual field review, taking geolocated images or video and sharing with the ETAT members. This could help refine the extent and magnitude of the environmental features identified from GIS. As mentioned earlier, we performed interviews with districts and ETAT members and reviewed several ACE studies to prepare this webinar. We found some best practices that you'll notice throughout the webinar. Identifying corridors and refining corridor paths could be accomplished by land suitability mapping, which has been used for several ACE studies. Since traffic is a primary purpose and need topic, consider developing future traffic projections to test the corridors. And for some projects, it could be used to test the study area. Provide an overview to ETAT members before beginning the review of ETDM screening event. As well, consider performing a field review. And of course, any questions, then reach out to OEM. They're here to help. Okay, so now let's take a few moments for questions before we begin lesson 2.
Thanks, Chris. Great job. So in the question response, we do not have any questions at this moment. If somebody does have any questions on the material Chris just covered, this is a great opportunity to put in those questions. And we'll just give you a minute to see if anything comes on. If not, we think we're doing a good job, and this doesn't end the conversation. Just because you don't ask any questions in this session, you can always ask questions later. We're happy to entertain everything. And even at the end of the webinar, that's not the end of the conversation. This material, there's a lot to digest, and a lot of times you're not actually going to necessarily use it until it's time to actually use it, and that's kind of when the questions come up. So just know you can always reach out to us and OEM at any time with any of that. So one of the questions that came in is, are economic impacts evaluated and considered? And Ted, I'm going to let you actually answer that one.
Certainly, economic considerations are part of purpose and need as we develop those, and they can be purpose and need components. So, and then as well, benefit cost analysis. Of course, this is that tough balance between what do you do in the ACE study and what do you do in PD&E. So I think each project is unique, so it's hard to answer that specifically. If anybody else wants to weigh in, please feel free.
Yeah, I would say it really depends on the project. I mean, you could perform some economic analysis early on to check maybe if that is a purpose and need topic, or that could be something that's left into the ACE study or in future phases of the project.
And even life cycle analysis can come into alternative selection.
Yep, that's true as well. There isn't one more question that came in. For a new alignment, there's difficulty in performing a field review. How would you handle that on a new alignment? So obviously, you know, depending on where that new alignment is going to be, your techniques are going to be very different. What are some of the techniques you can use with your team to get them up to speed on what's in that particular area if, you know, it's a new alignment in a new location and it's not very accessible? What are some of the things they can do out there?
So I can take that on. Can you hear me fine?
We can. Thank you, Sylvia.
Okay, great. So we actually had that example, and we limited the amount of field review that was used. So we work with the agencies to get the most up-to-date GIS data layers, and then where we knew that there were sensitive environmental areas like sensitive wetlands, we limited the field reviews to those locations and then updated the GIS layers to reflect that. We had to work with some of the agencies. For example, South Florida Water Management District needed to give us access to some of their lands, and that required some back and forth to be able to get into those areas. Knowing you're not going to be able to get into everything, you do the best that you can. Maybe in some cases, drones can be used to take a look at what the area looks like, but the intent is not to do heavy field work during the ACE process. It's to compare the alternative corridors to a degree that it's not NEPA work, it's pre-NEPA work, but to be able to compare them enough so you can see the main differences and eliminate those corridors that have substantially more impacts than other corridors.